Yessi using the URL on this slide for more information, and on there you can also subscribe to our newsletter for updates on events, funding and papers, and you can also follow us on Twitter for all of the latest updates. And as you can see on that slide, please, if you have any questions about the talk, please use the Q&A section on Zoom to type in your question, and as you'll have seen, the session is being recorded. Okay, Alice, could I have the first slide, please? Could you go back one slide, Alice, please? There should be a title slide. I will continue with that slide. I just wanted to introduce the topic that we were going to talk about. So Sarah and I are going to talk about connectivity and the degree to which we can include connectivity into conservation planning. So we're going to present a paper about this piece of work from Conservation Biology, which was published just earlier this year. And I guess it tackles a bigger question that we're interested in addressing in the biology department at York, which is about how to protect habitats and how to reduce biodiversity decline. So the paper is about that topic. And before I go any further, I'd just like to say thank you to all the co-authors. And as you can see here, there's a huge number of co-authors who are involved in this project. And this includes co-authors in the UK and in the US, as well as in Malaysia, where our project was focused. And just like to thank funding from the Rainforest Trust and also from the Darwin Initiative. Could I have the next slide, Alice, please? And so just to put it into a broader context where this piece of research and this paper is coming from, it's all about thinking about which bits of habitat to conserve and why, where and how much to conserve. So this is just to remind you, as I'm sure you are well aware, that biodiversity is in decline. And a recent IPBES report pointed out that about 1 million species may be threatened with extinction as a result of the activities that we carry out. And we know that natural habitats are being lost, and a lot of this is to do with conversion to other land uses, such as agriculture and urban areas. And that has huge impacts on deforestation rates, particularly in the area of the world that we work in, which is in Southeast Asia. And of course, loss of forests leads to increase in CO2 emissions, leading to climate warming. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, which all countries in the world have signed up to, have got targets called these HE targets to achieve over this past decade, to be completed by this year, 2020. And all countries have signed up to protect at least 17% of their land area. But some countries are doing even more than that, including Malaysia, where we'll be talking about today. And of course, these commitments, these so-called HE targets, we're sort of running out of time because of the commitments to reach those by the end of 2020. And the particular thing that we were interested in, that Sarah and I are going to be talking about, is about building in consideration of forest connectivity and providing corridors for animals into these commitments for protected areas. Have the next slide, Alice, please. So here's where we work, the Malaysian state of Sabah on Borneo. And you can see that Sabah is highlighted there by the blue ellipse in the top right-hand corner. Like a lot of areas in the tropics, it's undergone quite rapid land use change and loss of forest. It used to be completely covered by forest, but estimated about 50% remains. And that's shown in the map on the right. And you can see there two types of green, which are representing the pristine forest that is left, as well as areas of degraded and logged forest that's left. And about 50% of the area is remaining, and those black areas are areas of agriculture, primarily oil palm. So when we're considering Sabah, we know that many areas are already fully protected, but the state has decided to increase the amount of forest it wishes to protect, to have a state target of 30%, and it wishes to protect that by 2025. So in order to get up to 30% of the area protected, that requires about 300,000 hectares of additional forest to be raised up to higher levels of protection. So that was what we were tasked with, to try and work out where those areas should be and make recommendations to the state about how to raise their totally protected areas up to 30% of the total state land cover. Next slide, please, Alice. So here we are, this is Saba. So on the left there is a map that shows in green where areas that are already totally protected are. So these are bits of rainforest that already are totally protected, and in grey are the other areas of forest. And so those are areas that we were looking to see which areas of those grey should be additionally protected in order to make the whole totally protected area up to 30% of the land cover. Now, obviously, when you're thinking about what to prioritise and what to protect, there are a number of different things that you might want to consider. And amongst the co-authors, we decided to divide those into 7 different features that are listed here. So we decided across these 7 things, we would, if we could prioritise and combine all of these features in this multifaceted protection process, we would be incorporating a wide range of different aspects of biodiversity. So it includes threatened vertebrates and trees and invertebrates, which we focused on butterflies. So that's the first 3. We also wanted to consider ecosystem services from about above ground carbon, and also the different types of forest. So those are layers 4 and 7. And we also incorporated 2 aspects of connectivity. One was dispersal corridors to allow large animals to move around the state from different areas of protection and different forest areas. And the other was to ensure that the forest areas that were protected allowed for species to shift their range along climate gradients. So we call that climate connectivity. So we're not going to, you'll be pleased to know we're not going to go through all of those 7 layers in great detail, but Sarah's just going to tell you a little bit more about how those areas that at York we were most involved with carried out. So next slide, please, Alice. And over to Sarah now to talk about the 2 layers that she was involved with.
Great, thank you, Jane, and hello everyone. Can I have the next slide, please, Alice? Thank you. Yep, so I'm going to be talking about the input layers that we were specifically involved with at York, which were the restricted range butterflies and also the climate connectivity layer. Next slide, please, Alice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the butterfly layer first, and we took locality records from the Borneo Butterfly Distribution Database. This is the B2D2 database, which is freely available online. And this was put together by Mazidi Adghani and Susan Benedict. There's a photo of them at the bottom of the screen. And they were working at York several years ago on a Darwin Initiative grant, and they had the quite time-consuming job of putting together museum specimens, published papers, field reports and PhD theses of butterfly records and putting them into this database. So then I came along, filtered the records from this database from 1950 onwards, and for 77 range-restricted butterflies. So these are butterflies that were either endemic to the island of Borneo or restricted to Sunderland. And we chose these species because we thought that they are most likely to be of sort of highest conservation priority. And if you're interested in this study in a bit more detail, there's information at the bottom of the screen on the Biotropica paper that just came out about it in March. Next screen, please, Alice. So for the 77 range restricted butterflies, I ran 77 species distribution models. So I won't go into the technical details about these models, but I basically fitted them with 5 WorldClim environmental variables. So variables related to precipitation and temperature that are likely to be important for butterflies. A lot of these WorldClim variables are very intercorrelated, so we just picked 5 that were relevant. And the models were run using 3 mathematical algorithms, and you essentially average your results across these 3 algorithms, and then you the model produces output maps of likely distributions of the butterfly species. So on the bottom right of the screen are a couple of example output maps from these species distribution models for Troides andromache. So this is a butterfly found in Mount Kinabalu, so it's a high elevation butterfly. And you firstly get a probability of occurrence map, and secondly you have binary presence and absence map. So this is where the species are most likely to occur as predicted from the models. So then Sarah Williams from Montana took these probability of occurrence layers for each of the 77 butterflies, put them into Prioritizer in R, and came up with an overall prioritized area that was most important for butterflies. And that's the purple area shown on the map on the bottom left of the screen. So next slide, please, Alice. Thanks. So I thought I'd just look at these maps in a bit more detail. So the first map shows areas of high species richness in Sabah for the 77 butterflies. So this is basically where I added up the probability of distribution maps for all of those species. And so the blue areas show high species richness. And I think it's important to mention here that these are also the areas at high elevation. And many areas of high species richness were also found within the existing totally protected area network. So you can just about see that as outlined in black on the first figure. So then the second map shows the final prioritized layer for butterflies. And so you can see that it connects some of these higher elevation protected areas that are existing already. And so this was the layer that was used in the prioritization analysis in the conservation biology paper. Next slide, please, Alice. So then the second layer that I'm going to talk to you about is the climate connectivity layer. And this is based on some work that I did as part of my PhD with Jane at York. And there's also more information in our biological conservation paper, which there's details on the bottom of the slide. So I looked at the protected area network across the whole of Borneo, and based on current and future temperature projections, I determined which protected areas are likely to become too warm in future. And so I assumed that these are the protected areas from which species may need to move out of in order to track cooler climates. And these protected areas are shown in orange, and I've just given them the name of source PAs. Whereas the blue protected areas are generally at higher elevation, and these are likely to retain analogous climates in future, and that's because they span quite wide elevational gradients. And so I predicted that species may be able to track climate within these protected areas. And so this is all based on current empirical evidence that suggests that tropical species may need to shift uphill or to higher elevation in order to keep track of a warming climate. So unlike temperate species in the UK that are often moving northwards to track cooler climates, tropical species need to move to higher elevation. So just to summarize, the orange protected areas may become too warm, species may need to shift from them, but the blue protected areas may retain analogous climates in future. Next slide, please, Alice. So for part of my PhD work, I used Condatis connectivity models to examine important expansion routes connecting these low and high elevation protected areas. And I basically modeled the expansion of sort of hypothetical populations from these source protected areas that might become too warm to cooler target protected areas in future. So Condatis is a connectivity model that was developed by Jenny Hodgson at Liverpool that uses principles of both metapopulation theory and also electrical circuit theory to highlight important connections in the landscape. And you can read more about it on the Condatis website, which is on the slide. So the dark green areas basically represent potential expansion routes or important forest connections linking the source protected area to cooler protected areas in future. So this is kind of what we term elevational connectivity, and you can see this in both A and B. just in B, the source protected area, which is quite small, is very close to the target protected area. So the connections are quite concentrated. Next slide, please, Alice. So Jenny Hodgson and Lydia Cole, she was a technician at Liverpool, expanded on the work that I did as part of my PhD for the Rainforest Trust project. And we reran all of the Condatis models for Sabah, but with basically with better protected area maps from the Sabah Forestry Department and also higher resolution forest cover data. So we overlaid all of the connectivity maps for all of the source protected areas in Sabah onto this final map that you can see on the screen. And all of the source protected areas are shown in hatched orange, and the targets are shown in hatched black. So those are the cooler areas. And the purple areas that you can see on this map are areas that form important connections between these low elevation source protected areas and the target protected areas. So this was the map that was used as one of the connectivity layers in our prioritization that was used by Sarah. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to kind of summarize, there were 7 layers included in the prioritization, and you can find details on all of those in the manuscript and specifically in the supplementary material. And I just focused on the 2 that we were directly involved with at York. Next slide, please. So the map that I've just shown you shows the areas that we recommended for protection to the Sabah Forestry Department, and they're shown in orange. So we basically gave them a shapefile with these areas in it. And so in terms of next steps and moving forward, well, we have submitted these, as I just said, to the Sabah Forestry Department and also to the social teams working on this project, so Pecos Trust and BC Initiative, who are now conducting interviews with communities that actually live in some of these forests. And the pictures show some of these forest communities in locations that are actually being considered for Class 1 protection. And Jane and I were lucky enough to visit this area a couple of years ago as part of the project. So I think it's important to mention that if the forest becomes a fully protected Class 1 reserve, then people aren't allowed to live in it. And so we really must liaise with these local communities about where these new reserves are going to be placed. And so what might happen is that you have a large new Class 1 reserve, and then you could potentially extract smaller areas out of that will have another area, another class of protection. So these, for example, could be OECMs, so other effective area-based conservation measures. And that's something that SERP, the Southeast Asia Rainforest Research Partnership, are currently looking at the moment. Next slide, please. Just to kind of finish off with on my part, there's a few other considerations that you have to take into account in terms of moving forward. And this map shows the totally protected areas, and the in light green, I just want to draw your attention to the permanent forest reserves. So these are areas that are under forestry jurisdictional control, essentially. So some areas are politically easier to protect than others. So for example, a couple of these areas in light green are logging concessions where timber extraction is going on, and they're obviously bringing in quite a lot of income to the Sabah Forestry Department. So these are less likely, these are going to be less likely to be conserved as a Class 1 reserve compared to some other areas. Secondly, another thing to consider is there actually still forest present in some of these areas that we've recommended. So the forest cover data was from 2016, and obviously there's been substantial logging and conversion in recent months and years. So there's a lot of ground truthing that's going to be needed to actually make sure that these areas are still forested. And finally, I just think it's important to mention the sort of appropriate policy window to enforce this legislation. So there's been quite a lot of political change in Malaysia over the past couple of years. They've had a new Prime Minister, there's been a new Chief Conservator of Forests, so the head of the Sabah Forestry Department, and obviously different people have different priorities. But the Sabah Forestry Department is going to stick with this commitment of increasing these new reserves. So we're hoping that this new legislation will be in place by 2025. But we're going through kind of repeated rounds of prioritization, locking in and locking out different areas after talking to the Sabah Forestry Department and also the social teams. So that's basically where we are at the moment. And I'm just going to hand back over to Jane for some final thoughts.
We seem to have lost another slide, unfortunately, Alice. So I'm just going to go back to some other thoughts that I had to bring together some of these ideas. And I suppose there are two things I'd like to pick out. One is a more applied issue, which Sarah's already alluded to, about this back and forth about providing updated maps and talking with the Sabah government about which areas are more likely to be able to be included or not, including talking to local people and the consequences for them. And the other is a more academic output, which is the fact that we are able to produce a multifaceted conclusion to make recommendations for which incorporation of connectivity didn't have a detrimental impact on the ability to conserve other important aspects of biodiversity. So just some thoughts I'd like to leave you with, and also maybe to generate some discussion. The first one we've already mentioned is about thinking about what are the impacts for local communities if forests become totally protected and therefore local communities are not able to access those forest areas. The next one is a slightly wider discussion about, whilst it's great that Sabah has committed to a 30% commitment for preserving rainforest, I guess my question might be, is 30% enough? And some of you may know of initiatives around conserving this half Earth idea, that half of the Earth should be put aside for biodiversity. And so is 17% enough, which is what the CPD commitment and the HE target is, and then of course is 30% enough? And then a slightly bigger question is, how connected do our forests need to be to make sure that they are connected enough for what we wish them to do? And then the other general point is, we talk here about forests, but we very carefully not talked to you about what we mean by forest. And actually we spent a lot of time talking about how we identify what is forest and what to protect. And I would point out that quite a lot of the areas that we're recommending are protecting have already been degraded and logged. But our recommendation would be it's much better to protect these areas than it is to think about reforestation and planting trees. So even forest that's been quite degraded is important for biodiversity and for protection. And I'd just like to finish off with something even broader context, which is about thinking about who should pay for conserving forests and who should be paying to protect carbon and therefore to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's enough from me, enough comments and considerations from me. So over to you if you've got any questions.
That's great, thank you, Jane. So this is Alice from Yesi. So I will be reading you the questions, and then it would be great if you could answer them. Just so that our audience are aware, if you want to type any questions, feel free to do that in the Q&A box found at the bottom by hovering over the base of the screen. Once you've asked your question, we will unmute. Once I've asked your question, we will unmute you, so that you can elaborate or ask any further questions once Jane and Sarah have answered for you. I thought I'd just kick off with a question first, if that's okay. I was just wondering how, so the work's obviously focused in Sabah, how or can the modelling you've used be applied in the UK, and how will that shape sort of UK environmental impact assessments? Jane, is that one for you?
Yeah, no, thanks, Alice. That's a really good question, because I guess one of the things that we did consider is that although you can see that there's been quite a lot of modelling and a complexity to selecting which areas to recommend to prioritise for protection, actually we were focusing on a single habitat, which was rainforest. And so because we were working on Borneo and because all of the biodiversity is forest dependent, all of our focus was around thinking which areas of forest to protect and where to protect. And I think if you move outside of the tropical regions, then clearly there's a much wider range of different habitat types that we might want to focus around. So for instance, if we were working in the UK, we would be probably thinking about upland areas, moorland areas, wetlands, boggy areas, woodlands, grasslands, and so on. And so that would add a huge amount of complexity to the modelling. So in some ways, although what we did obviously looks quite complex, in some ways the question was simpler than it would be in the UK, because we were just focusing around that one habitat, which was rainforest. I'll pass over to Sarah in case she wants to add anything to that.
No, I think you covered that question quite well. But I mean, in theory, you could run a kind of prioritization like this in any kind of setting. But yeah, it would just depend on what habitat type you specifically want to conserve. So we're obviously focusing on rainforest, so it would be a little bit more difficult in the UK. But you could perhaps do it for kind of for one particular habitat type, for example, and then put in the important species that might be living in that habitat, for example.
Okay, well, great. Thank you for answering that. We have a question in our Q&A. So this is from Vicky. She's asking, is it possible to work with the local people to maintain their homes and livelihoods, perhaps even bring in new employment through conservation and conserve the forest and any associated traditional knowledge? So I suppose, how can we work better with the local people? Jane, do you want to start with that one?
Yes, we recognised right from the very start of the project that it was really important to not only include ecologists and conservationists like ourselves, sitting well away from Borneo at our computers, coming up with maps to make recommendations to the state government about where to protect. We realised right from the outset that this needed to be a dialogue with local people whose livelihoods are dependent on the forest areas that we might have been recommending to uplift for protection, and of course also those areas that we weren't recommending for protection, what might happen to those. So all the way through, we've been involving PACOS and other social NGOs to make sure they understand the decisions that we're making, why we're making them, and then they can feed that back to the local communities about where these decisions are coming from, so that we understand what those implications might be. And I guess the state of Sabah is similar to other places in the world in which it's recognised, if it looks back, it has perhaps in the past has made decisions without incorporating the views of local people. And as you can imagine, that can cause issues about people not feeling that they've had a contribution into decisions which are affecting their livelihoods. If part of a expectation of forest protection is that people don't go in and use the forest in whatever way that may be, that's going to have much bigger impacts on what the implications of protection are than if we were to assume that protection wouldn't immediately mean that local people couldn't make use of those forests. And I think there's a really important dialogue to take place there for people to much better understand how local people use forest and what the implications are for the forest. So of course, one of the big issues with Sabah is a huge amount of its income comes through palm oil production. And when we're thinking about the supply chain for palm oil and consumers of palm oil products, those are people in Europe, people like ourselves, who are very concerned about sustainability issues through the supply chain and are wanting to make sure that countries that produce palm oil are making very strong commitments to its sustainability. And palm oil now has a if you purchase and consume palm oil from sustainable sources, then it's coming from locations where they've made commitments to zero deforestation in their food chain. And so in that supply chain, sorry. So therefore, as a consumer, we may also want to know exactly what protecting forest means and what types of forest are protected and what the implications are. So we need to know if that, for example, might involve the forest being protected under a different classification, which allowed local people to go in and make use of the forest, which might involve going in to take out non-timber products or food from the forest that they would wish to use themselves. So I think that question is a really good one, but it operates in both directions. It's about what we expect as a consumer, as well as what local stakeholders expect because of what they need from the forest.
That's great. Sarah, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
I guess the only thing that I would add to that is that we are potentially going to be going through finer scale prioritization, locking in and locking out areas in the prioritization analyses that are important for local communities. So it may be that you could designate a large class 1 forest reserve, but essentially cookie cut out or extract areas that are important for the communities, and they could be another kind of forest reserve. So they wouldn't be the strictest category class 1, but they could be kind of community forest areas or OECMs, as I mentioned earlier. So they would have they would still be protected, but they would have a different level of protection.
Okay, great. We should have Vicky unmuted. Vicky, are you there?
I am. Hey.
Excellent. Has that answered your question?
Yeah, that was brilliant. I think what Jane was saying about having the dialogue set up between across like the whole chain of like local people, government, conservationists, and consumers is really interesting. And I guess I was sort of also curious because I know lots of like Indigenous people who are like dependent upon forests for their livelihoods, and if they live there, they know more. They know about the conservation of the forest as well, and they know like how much to harvest or how much, like, you know, unless there's kind of external influence such as consumers wanting products with palm oil. Like, is there's a way of integrating that kind of knowledge into sort of the conservation that is being sort of suggested, and like the work that YESI promotes and things like that?
Jane, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and there's a lot of complexity around this, as I'm sure people can imagine. And one of the things around the discussion with local stakeholders is just ensuring that everybody agrees on land ownership, because there's a lot of complexity around that, and about who makes decisions and who has input, and not all local stakeholders will agree with each other about what they might wish to see. So I think there's a huge amount of variation in all of these aspects, and the assumption that all local stakeholders will agree on what they want to happen to the areas around them is a long ongoing dialogue as well.
Great. And Sarah, anything to add? No? Okay, great. We'll move on to the next one. Thank you, Vicky, for your question.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next question comes from Caroline Ward. She is asking, given that there are villages within the areas that you have identified for prioritisation, do you think it's feasible that Malaysia can reach 30% protected area coverage or even higher? I know, Jane, you posted that question as a thought, so what are your thoughts on that one?
No, that's a good question, Caroline. And there are a lot of villages in the areas that have been highlighted as potential areas for protection, but there are also quite large forest areas which don't have large communities nearby. And one of the things that the state government asked us to look at very specifically was to make sure that our recommendations for prioritisation were sort of large clumps of forest, if you like, rather than areas that were scattered across Sabah. So we had discussions with them around, for example, whether adding bits of forest to existing protected areas or coming up with 1 or 2 large tracts of forest would make more sense from a pragmatic perspective, and very much in the sort of to and fro of that is to also avoid areas where the Sabah government was very aware that uplifting to protection was not going to be popular locally. So we already knew which areas to avoid. And one of the large areas that it looks like it's going to go ahead and receive protection is a large areas of forest to the southwest of Sabah, which borders on Indonesia onto Kalimantan. And that was a large ex-logging area. And so there aren't many people currently living in that area. So hopefully we'll reduce impacts for local stakeholders. So in terms of whether it can reach 30%, well, yeah, there's a lot of forest left in Sabah, particularly if you lower your threshold for what you consider forest to be. So in our prioritization, we had quite a low threshold to make sure we could include quite heavily degraded areas and areas that, if left to restore, could restore back to very much high quality natural forest. So we set the threshold at about 40 tons of carbon per hectare, which is quite a low threshold. So it includes sort of scrubby areas as well. So I think we've got quite a lot of area to choose from to reach that 30% target. I'll pass over to Sarah. If you've got anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say that what Jane said as well is that there is still quite a lot of forest left in Sabah. Over half of Sabah is still forested, so there are quite a lot of areas to choose from, and there are areas where people aren't living that will be easier to allocate, and then you would have to do a finer scale prioritization in some of the areas where there are communities, essentially. But I mean, the protected area cover of Sabah now is sort of 25% or so. So actually you're not really increasing that much, and there is quite a large area of forest still to choose from, some of which is under the sort of control of the Sabah Forestry Department logging concessions or old logging concessions, and yeah, and some of it is not under control of forestry, which may be a bit more difficult. That's probably what I would add to that.
Great, thank you for that. Caroline, have you been unmuted? Has that answered your question?
Yeah, that was really great. Thank you, guys. I think also it feeds into the bit you were talking about earlier about putting areas under protected status doesn't necessarily mean a kind of classification one of a strict protection as well. So yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So there's been a couple of similar topics here. So people are asking about sort of the positive relationships of the villagers. So do villagers living in potential class 1 zones have relationships with butterflies, for example? So the use of allotments and things like that, are they actually having a positive impact in the area? Should we start with Sarah with that one?
Yeah, so as far as I know, there aren't people living in class 1 zones at the moment, but they are could be living on the edges of class 1 zones. And so yeah, you can get spillover of well, butterflies and other insect pollinators, bees and things from the forest into agricultural plantations, and some of our research has shown that, and that can be beneficial for pollination of crops. And lots of these forest communities kind of cultivate lots of different types of crops, mainly for their own consumption. So yeah, if that could improve the kind of productivity of the crops next to these forest areas, and then yeah, there could be some kind of positive feedback of having the forest close by.
And Jane, can you build on that?
Yeah, I would say that one of the reasons we chose to focus on butterflies was because of the availability of data. So we use the butterflies as representative of a wide range of different invertebrate groups in the absence of data for nearly anything else. So as is fairly typical globally, one of the most popular invertebrates to study is butterflies, and so we have lots of really good information for those. I mean, going right back to Victorian times when Alfred Russel Wallace was travelling in Southeast Asia. I mean, he was recording the butterflies on in Sabah, so we have some good knowledge on the distributions of those. So that's the first one, is that it's a sort of more theoretical reason to focus on butterflies. The other one is that the Raja Brook butterfly is a very iconic birdwing butterfly for Sabah. It's not particularly threatened, but it's a symbolic and iconic species that is useful to focus people's interest around, because people care a lot about it, because it's such an amazing species. So it's important to conserve. So it's quite useful for sort of communication and public interest in what we're doing and thinking about why we want to conserve forest. And just thinking a bit more broadly about local people in Sabah, not just in the villages, but thinking more widely, is that tourism is really important to the economy of Sabah, and there's a lot of interest both from Malaysian tourists and more widely from tourists more widely. A lot of that is focused around birds, but not all of it, and so thinking about conserving forests and thinking about the butterfly diversity that is protected is important, not only because of important ecosystem functions or so on, but also to the local economy. I would say in terms of pollinators, oil palm is an introduced crop. So it's introduced from West Africa, and they introduced its pollinator with it from West Africa, because when it was introduced originally, it had quite low yield because the Southeast Asian pollinators that are there were not very effective. So arguing from a pollination perspective for many of the crops that are grown is probably not that important. I would make an argument for a number of different reasons instead.
Okay, that's great. I think that question came from Amy. Amy, are you there? Do you want to ask any more on that?
Yeah, hello. No, thank you. That was really great. I really enjoyed hearing about how the people that have a relationship with, charismatic creatures like we do in the UK, maybe with how we relate to a badger or something, in terms of conservation and how we relate to the other species around us. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Great, thank you, Amy.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that comment from Amy as well, because I guess the discussion that's going on in Malaysia as well is very much like discussions here in the UK as well, which is about the degree to which Sabah people are supporting the fact that Sabah is making these commitments, and the degree to which maybe for some people might consider the removal of forest and converting more of it to palm oil or other crops that will bring in more profit might be a more sensible thing for Sabah to do. So within the state, there's also quite a big discussion about the degree to which everybody is supportive of uplifting to 30%.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a couple of other questions. I'm not sure if we've already kind of answered those, but I'll ask them anyway, and then you can see. So we've got one from Chris Thomas, and he's asking, are any of the species positively associated with villages or abandoned villages in forests? So he's saying, for example, in India, deer that are food for tigers are most plentiful in abandoned agricultural areas, and they're actually managing to maintain these spaces, and the same goes for logged forests. So I don't know if you just want to build on maybe Chris's comment about the deer in the agricultural areas. Jane, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, Chris, and I probably won't answer it because I think sorry, I won't be able to answer it, I should say. I'll try and answer it, but I think part of the issue is that we probably don't know what some of those interactions are. And one thing we would say is that we went through with the different layers to look to see how many of the layers for the different categories, whether it be carbon or connectivity or the biodiversity of butterflies or mammals or whatever, to look to see how much overlap there was and the degree to which if we hadn't have included all 7 layers, we might have come up with broadly similar conclusions about which were the best areas of forest to preserve. When we first started doing our analyses, quite a few people in SABA said, oh, I don't know why you're bothering. I could just tell you which are the best bits of forest to conserve without you spending 18 months doing all of this modelling. And actually, some of the areas that we did pick perhaps haven't surprised people that much, because the area of existing forest, the very large patch of existing forest in the southwest of Sabah, was very obvious as somewhere that was going to be picked out. One of the things I found quite interesting was the degree that there was a lot of overlap, and maybe that's because there aren't that many large areas of forest left, and so the modelling didn't really have that many areas to choose from in terms of prioritising. And so when we removed the connectivity layers out and just reran the prioritisation, it more or less picked the same areas again. And of course, because we had our threshold for deciding what was forest and where to think about protecting quite low, much lower than perhaps some people would designate as to what was really true forest, because it would bring out some of these scrubby areas. We were picking out locations that we know do have quite high biodiversity, even though they're quite heavily disturbed. So that's how I would try and answer your question, Chris, but I know you're going to tell me that I haven't quite answered what you were asking for. So
shall we go over to Chris and see if he wants to elaborate on that? Chris, are you there?
Yeah, I am here. Yeah, I mean, I think that's great that it's pretty robust across a number of different predictive variables. What I was really sort of getting at and thinking about is that given that the forest has been to a greater or lesser extent perturbed, at least slightly, is the extent to which the desired features of the different areas are a sort of some long-standing thing that will always survive if you just leave them, or whether people are going to start intervening with some kind of management. And sort of in a couple of other countries that I've visited, it seems to me that once people have declared parks, they can't then stop themselves from wanting to manage it to maximize the numbers of some desired features within those. And I guess it's quite complicated when you've got sort of mixed human histories as well as the underlying natural biodiversity. So I don't think there's an answer to this, but I kind of, you know, declaring them as protected areas, let's say, is the first step of wondering what you're going to do.
yeah, no, if I can come back on that, absolutely. So in Malaysia, there is generally no management in protected areas. So once the protected area has been designated, that's it essentially. And so with the designation of which has happened recently, of some previously logged areas, there has been some discussion and some experiments being carried out to try and find out whether some sort of active management will actually lead to faster forest restoration. So there's been some management to cut down lianas to see whether that helps with the restoration, and also a bit of enrichment planting as well. But generally, there's not a huge amount of that, and most of it is just to leave it be and hope that it regenerates. So there's quite a lot of discussion around the degree to which management will be effective. And the other thing that nobody seems to be discussing or considering is the degree to which some of these protected areas are actually delivering what people want. So, for example, on Borneo, conservation of pygmy elephant and also of orangutan is uppermost in a lot of people's minds. But I'm not aware that anybody has set targets for the degree to which they would hope that, say, orangutan populations would increase in future as a consequence of increases in protected areas. So the degree to which people are going to be disappointed, shall we say, if their expectation of raising protected areas to 30% isn't delivered in a way that perhaps nobody's really captured yet, which is what do people expect will happen to their landscape and will happen to Sabah if they make this commitment. What are they hoping that's going to translate to? And I don't think that's been discussed or decided, and that's where my I suppose my concern comes, that they may have very high expectations about what this is going to deliver for biodiversity, for carbon storage, for reducing their greenhouse gases and so on, which may not deliver.
Great, thank you, Jane. Okay, so I think we've hopefully answered Chris's question there. Sarah, was there anything else you wanted to add to Jane's comments?
No, not really. I don't think I can answer the question either, to be honest. But other than that, logged forests have been shown to have really quite high numbers of species, birds and mammals, and that if these new protection is put in place, then they could regenerate over time. Obviously, this does depend on things like edge effects and how degraded they are to start with. And I guess just one final point is that you would need to make sure that these areas are connected as well. So any of the new protected areas should also be connected to other large areas of forest, which is what we were actually trying to do with the kind of dispersal connectivity layer in the models. And then you might get movement of species, in and out of these reserves. So yeah, great. That's what I would really add on that.
Thank you. Okay, so just scrolling through our Q&A, I think we've answered everyone's. Oh, there's just one from Amy, which we may have brushed on already. She's saying, how have you found interacting with people during the project? So particularly with people in logging and palm oil industry. If you've had any interactions with them, how have you felt that has gone with them? Jane, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so Sarah mentioned a visit that we had where we went around the local communities to talk to them about what we were doing, about what was the aim of the project and the next steps. And we visited the local communities with the social NGO, with PACOS, to hopefully convince local communities and the local stakeholders that there was a lot of transparency in this. But Sarah also mentioned, you may well be aware that there's quite a lot of things are happening politically in Malaysia and also in Sabah at the moment. So I don't know the degree to which local communities have a lot of trust in their local government at the moment to make the right decision for them and a good decision for them. So we're sort of hoping that over the next year or so this dialogue will continue during this period of political change, that not only will this policy window remain open and that people in Sabah will want to continue to commit to raising their level of protected forest, but that it will actually happen in a way that as many people as possible agree is a good thing. But we spend a lot of time working with palm oil companies, and I would say it's quite mixed. There are some companies who are very aware of the detrimental impacts that they're having on the environment and want to minimize that, and I don't think I'm being naive. I think they really do want to do that. Some of that is driven by access to European markets, so some of that's driven by financial reasons, but I think some of it is that people do really want to minimize the impact that they're having on the natural world. And then, perhaps not surprising, there are other companies who just want to spread and make as much money as possible. So it's not very different than most other places in the world, to be quite honest. So I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, so we didn't really have any interaction with the logging or palm oil industries directly in this project, but we were interacting with Sabah Forestry Department, which was generally very positive, although a lot of those discussions were facilitated by our local collaborators and members of SERP as well. But yeah, I mean, I've worked with the palm oil industry for quite a few years and doing fieldwork in plantations and things, and generally the people that I've worked with have been very positive. So these are kind of larger plantations that are interested in sustainability. They are also Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil certified, so they are pushing the kind of environmental agenda. But there are, as Jane said, there are other palm oil companies, and I haven't had any negative experiences with them because they just don't want to work with us at all. So we weren't able to sample in a lot of palm oil plantations out in Sabah because they just don't want scientists coming onto their concessions, essentially. So yeah, it's very mixed.
Great, thank you. Amy, does that answer the question?
Yeah, that was great, thank you. I attended a talk last year at the Uni of Sheffield that was basically talking about that, the difference between larger plantations, smaller plantations, and the different relationships with scientists that come about. So yeah, it was really great to hear your experiences, and yeah, thank you once again for this talk today. It's been really good, thank you.
Great, thank you. Right, I think we're getting towards the end, so I think we'll wrap up there if that's okay with everyone. If you have got a question and I've missed it, please feel free to pop it in an email to Yessie, or we will be sending out a survey later on, and there'll be an option to add any follow-on questions in there, and Jane and Sarah, I'm sure, will take the time to respond to your question. And again, if you've got any information or anything you'd like to share with Jane and Sarah, please do feel free to email Yessie or Jane and Sarah directly to spark any conversations. So I'd just like to say on behalf of Yessie, thank you very much, Jane and Sarah, for taking the time to have a discussion with us about your paper. It's been really interesting. And I'd just like to give a bit of a plug to the next event that is coming up. So next week, we're really keen to try and do these hopefully weekly or every 2 weeks, just to give people something to do during the lockdown and just get your brains working. So the next one is going to be with Dr. Bryce Stewart, and he's going to be talking about his marine conservation work in the Isle of Arran. So he's going to be looking at how sort of community-based protected areas, how they work. So if you want to join us on the 7th of May at 12:30, feel free. You can sign up to that on the Yessie website on the events page. And just before we go, Jane and Sarah, do you have anything you want to kind of leave any final comments just as we go off? Jane, do you have anything you'd like to say?
No, I don't think I have anything else to say other than I'm sure you can imagine it's been a fantastic opportunity and a real pleasure to be able to work on these sorts of questions and to work with colleagues in Sabah on such an amazing place. And when we get out of lockdown and you have an opportunity to visit and you haven't done so, do visit Sabah. It's an amazing place with fantastic people.
Sarah?
No, I don't have anything extra to add other than it was great to work on such a kind of policy relevant project and actually see your science being kind of integrated into actual real life policy. So that's been great.
Excellent. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and again, we'd be happy to receive any comments or feedback in the feedback form we send later, either today or tomorrow. Okay, so hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye.